I'm at an author event last week, and on one hand, we have award-winning author whose latest book, the New York Times considered one of the top 10 books of 2018, but more importantly, was in contention for the BookTube Prize. I had the good fortune of reading it as part of my judge's duties. It was Rebecca Mackay's The Great Believers, the highly researched novel, in part about the height of the AIDS epidemic in Chicago. On the other hand, we have the reigning Korean-American author of the moment, responsible for such works as Queen of the Night and Edinburgh, there to talk about his latest book, How to Write an Autobiographical Novel. Of course, it's him growing up gay during the height of the AIDS epidemic. This would be Alexander Chee, and all of this moderated by AIDS historian Sarah Schulman. So fantastic. It was one of those sessions where an hour goes by far too quickly, and before you know it, it is over. They got a chance to talk about their works in progress, writing their novels, and a little bit about the straightwashing of certain gay narratives. How the multiple award-winning Angels in America is still concerned with gay abandonment, whiteness, and straight salvation. How Philadelphia, Tom Hanks' character, also abandoned, needs to seek the help of a straight lawyer. And before you know it, we're on to the Q&A section. And this is where a POC gay author and two women have to sit there and be mansplained about their opinions. The first guy gets up and says, Angels in America is still a valid piece of art, which they never really argued, and was kind of offended at their pushback. And then another person gets up and says, well, isn't Tom Hanks' character essentially smart for hiring a straight lawyer because the jury is going to be mostly straight? And I'm thinking, really? This is the best that you can do? You have these accomplished authors on the stage, and this is what you want to ask them? I keep waiting for someone to put their hand up and ask, oh, where do you get your ideas from? Or, could you read my manuscript? I mean, come on, Toronto. I thought you could do better than this. Sometimes author Q&As can just suck, but these authors are pros. They handled it well, and suddenly we're on to book signings, which is, for an introvert, horrifying. It is basically small talk with someone you admire under strict time constraints. Aquafina. Starbucks line, 20 seconds, go. Did you know Aquafina is really a filtered tap water sold by Pepsi that the internet believes doesn't freeze? I love you in Crazy Rich Asians. See, it's impossible. So I agonized for a long time over what I was going to ask Alexander Chee, and I settled on just thanking him for introducing me to the first Korean-American author, Young-Hil Kang. Alexander Chee had mentioned it in his social media. He was writing the foreword to the Penguin Classics reissue of the book, and actually shoot a video about East Goes West earlier. Anyway, in a perfectly gift teacher move, he looks at me and says, well, what did you think? And then I get to go off and talk about how I can't believe it's not part of the American canon, and I'm just outraged that I've never heard of Young-Hil Kang ever before, and suddenly we're having this back and forth. We're having a conversation. Alexander Chee and I are basically besties now. And it's great. He is as warm and as lovely as you would suspect, and I am completely spent. So I sidle over, and there's Rebecca Mackay, and I'm drawing a blank. And the best I can mutter is, thanks for coming to Canada. And then I stare at her silently as she signs my book. So I guess you win some, you lose some. Anyway, while I'm humble bragging here, I also last week got the chance to see Don Winslow in conversation with Linwood Barclay. Don Winslow is responsible for the Cartel trilogy, the last book of which, called The Border, I finished and is sitting at an incredible 4.47 star rating over on Goodreads with well over 5,000 reviews. This thing is a doorstopper of a read, and the trilogy as a whole is Tolkien-esque in terms of sheer heft and plotlines. Linwood Barclay, I have to admit I've not read. He's a crime novelist and a favorite of Stephen King's. Anyway, the conversation between those two was also great. Winslow talked about his past life as a PI working the Times Square beat, basically being mugging bait and busting low-level dealers. He also talked about writing Savages, which was a huge departure for him and perhaps would end his writerly career. He was asked by Linwood Barclay if he could recount the first chapter. Easy enough. The first chapter actually consists of 2 words, which can be further abbreviated to F-U. This entire story was a complete departure from his old style. He broke all the writerly rules, and he wasn't sure how it was going to land. Was obviously petrified. So he talks about flying over and landing in Heathrow, completely jet-lagged, doesn't even know what time it is, and he gets a phone call. His wife picks up, and she says, "It's your son. He needs to talk to you." Which, of course, as a parent, you never want to hear those words when your child is in a completely different country So he picks up the phone and his son is like, have you seen the paper? And he's like, of course not. I haven't seen the paper. I've been on an airplane all this time. It's the New York Times. Janet Maslin loved your book. It was a review that would change his writerly trajectory. Savages would go on to be made into a film. I don't know how good of a film, but a film by Oliver Stone. He doesn't remember too much after that fact. His wife gets dropped off at the hotel. He finds himself on an event bus heading to the event itself, sitting across from a stylish woman reading the paper who looks up from the paper to say, "You're Don Winslow." Hell of a review today. That woman would be Joyce Carol Oates. So Don, he gives good story. And that's not really an assumed, because writers are typically isolated. But I guess writers are having to think a little bit more about their social media profiles and reflect on their role as storytellers. Question period was markedly different this time. The moderator stood up before the Q&A and quietly admonished the audience to please refrain from making statements or merely voicing opinion, to the appreciated laughter of the audience. And it was this great lively discussion, a back and forth, with only one statement, the last question of the night. It was an older woman that stood up and asked that Don Winslow please refrain from using the term addict, that she herself had lost her son, and that the term is substance use disorder. And Don Winslow was gracious. He had talked about the fact that he has been to hundreds of these events over the course of writing the trilogy, and that every single one of them, someone from the audience has stood up and told a story of losing a loved one to drugs. And he talks about losing some of his friends and people that he was researching during the writing of the novel. And to him, they were all addicts. But he was still gracious. He heard her complaint, acknowledged her pain, pushed back gently on the use of the word addict as it applies to the characters in the novel, much to the satisfaction of her as well as the audience, and spent some time after the show privately talking with her as well. Winslow, clearly a pro. Audience questions are such a fine balancing act, and I never know how to properly do that, but it's become all the more pressing because I'm responsible for getting those questions started at the Toronto International Festival author events that I'm attending in case there are no audience questions. And I keep thinking about this George Carlin comedic bit about driving and how when you're driving, anyone driving faster than you is a maniac, a speed demon liable to get themselves killed, basically an asshole. Meanwhile, anyone driving slower than you is a feeble-sighted, hat-wearing octogenarian that drives like my grandmother eats porridge, slow and sloppy. And it's like that with questions. They're either oblivious, completely missing the point, or far too self-congratulatory and showboaty, this whole man with the mic syndrome that we're seeing so much of lately. The point of asking a question is for the presenter to shine, not to draw undue attention to the person asking. Anyway, I'm really curious from all you bookish folks, what is your go-to question? What do you ask an author when you get to the front of the line at an author signing? Or do you just sort of sit there blubbering quietly to yourself as they sign your book looking at you kind of funny? This week is going to be crazy. There's a lot of events I'm attending with the Toronto International Festival of Authors going on right now. I don't know how people do it, how they make the commute in and out of Toronto every day. Traffic just sucks. But I'm still grateful for the opportunity, really looking forward to some of those events. So that is it for me this week. I hope you all have a great week of reading, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.